15 years ago, maybe a little longer. I was in my early 20s, and I was living the I'm gonna be famous someday life. I was never a good student, and I was always the class clown. One thing that I always did well as a kid was make my friends laugh. Instead of going to college or getting a job right after high school, I decided I was going to become a stand-up comedian. Spoiler alert, I did not become a famous comedian, which maybe is the best joke of my stand-up career. Instead, I had nearly a decade of bombing on stage, and even worse than that, the most terrifying single-handed experience of my life happened to me. For a little bit of context, doing stand-up is hard and definitely not lucrative when you're not successful. Not to mention, stand-up comedy was not as popular as it is today. To say it is a grind is an understatement. You question your decisions every time you perform until you get that one crowd that laughs at one of your jokes. The high you experience from the crowd laughing and cheering is intoxicating, and I assume that's why comedians constantly keep grinding. Part of the grind is finding gigs that will pay you, or even just let you perform for a couple of minutes. I was fortunate enough to have several open mics in my hometown, but you're not getting paid at an open mic, and a lot of the time you're sharing the stage with all sorts of other talented people and not just comedians. Nothing kills a comedian's momentum like performing after someone who just poured out their soul with life-altering poetry. After a few years of performing at open mics, I decided to try to reach out to club promoters and local comedians who would get booked for actual shows. Most of the time, these shows would be several hours away if I were lucky. Usually, they were even further than that. I did a few shows, and this is where the grind gets real. It's also where my story takes a very terrifying turn. I didn't have very good luck with these traveling shows. I wasn't getting paid, and I was driving 4 or 5 hours across state lines just for 5 minutes of exposure. Not an ideal situation for someone who was broke and barely had any income coming in. One night, I had an amazing opportunity to perform at a show that was being held 5 hours from where I lived. This show was a competition for comedians trying to break into the mainstream. The first place prize was $1,000, but the real prize for me was that several moderately famous comedians were going to be the judges of the show. It was my chance to show actual comedians that I have talent. The worst part for me when I would make all these trips was that I had a garbage car and an old cell phone that was about as reliable as those big 1980s brick cell phones. I would always think to myself that if something happened, I would be stranded. My drives almost always consisted of nothing but farmland and open fields as far as you could see. Because I was a lazy person, I didn't bother to double-check my printed-out MapQuest directions. Instead, I decided to wing it, something I still regret to this day. I was lost. The directions I had did not match where I was. I had been on a backcountry road for some time, and I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. Thankfully, I always left for the traveling jobs early just in case I got lost. I may have been lazy, but I know myself well, and getting lost was not uncommon for me. It was still daylight when I started driving through a small town. Honestly, calling it a small town might be a stretch. There were a few beat-up old buildings and houses on a street that was maybe a couple of 100 feet in length. Outside of an old gas station, there were a few individuals who looked less than welcoming. I know that's kind of rude to say they were dirty and mean, but they were rude to me. They didn't look like they were using or anything like that. They just looked like they'd been beaten up by life. I asked where I was and tried asking them if I was on the right track. They were short with me, and after an awkward back and forth exchange, they finally told me where I needed to go. According to the rude townspeople, I was still somewhat on the right track. Somehow, I had missed a turn a while back, but if I stayed straight on this road for a while, eventually I would see the road I needed to be on. I thanked them and filled up my tank before I set off again. While I was pumping the gas, I noticed several of the people I had just talked to were staring at me. It was uncomfortable for sure. It was those dead-eyed stares, and it wasn't just one of them. I counted at least 4 of them just staring and standing completely still like a statue. It made me feel all sorts of weird. I finished up and got out of that small town as fast as I could. I started driving and rehearsing my routine to myself. I kept thinking about how ironically funny my conversation with the townspeople was, and I even tried thinking of ways that I could incorporate this experience into my stand-up routine. Not long after leaving the town, a beat-up white pickup truck flew by me going very fast. I didn't think anything of it at the time. When it was around dusk, I had been driving for nearly an hour since I left the town. There was nothing but trees on the left and right sides of the road. I had that gut feeling that I was probably lost. As I continued down the road, I heard a loud sound from underneath my car. and I started losing control of the vehicle. I knew right away what had happened. It was unmistakable. I had somehow gotten a flat tire. I pulled over to inspect the damage. I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't just a flat tire. Both of my front tires were completely obliterated. When I leaned over to take a closer look, I noticed that the tires were impaled with several nails. I pulled out my terrible cell phone, and of course, the service was not good. I tried calling a tow truck, but I had no idea where I was or even what road I was on. I hung up the phone. Instead of panicking, I was starting to get angry that I was going to miss the show. I was stupid, and my priorities were elsewhere. I decided to call one of my friends. I described everything that I remembered about the drive, and I told him about the small town with the gas station. He told me he was going to try to look up where I was and that he would call me back. I didn't know if I should just stay put in the car or I should try walking back in the direction of the town. I decided to stay put in the car because now that it was almost completely dark, it was starting to get cold. It was clear now that I wasn't going to make the show. While I was waiting to hear back from my friend, I noticed two bright headlights popping out from the horizon behind me. The headlights stopped moving a good distance from my car and didn't continue in my direction. The car was close enough that the lights were bright and annoying, but far enough away that I could not tell what kind of car it was. I don't know if it was a cop or some local trying to call the police to report a vehicle on the side of the road. If you're wondering why I didn't just call the police, it's because I was driving a car that was not inspected or properly insured at the time, and I wasn't trying to get that ticket in another state. Several minutes went by, and the car never moved. It just stayed parked a good distance behind me, shining those bright lights. After probably a good 5 minutes or so, the bright lights started to get a little closer. The vehicle was slowly moving towards the back of my car. As that was happening, two more lights could be seen in front of me, making their way toward me quickly. The loud vehicle stopped inches from my car. Eventually, the car that was behind me was parked directly behind my car, and I still couldn't tell who it was. While I was trying to adjust my eyes to the bright light in my rearview mirror, I noticed that the car doors from the vehicle in front of me were now open. That's when I noticed it was a white pickup truck, the same beat-up white pickup truck from earlier. Before I could notice anyone coming, I heard a loud bang on the driver's window, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the rude man from the gas station. I started to panic because the man was trying to open my car door. Even though it was locked, he was aggressively pulling on the door. He started to beat on the car window. I wasn't sure how long my window would last before it broke. As this was going on, I noticed one of the other men from the car make his way to the passenger side of my car. He also started to aggressively try to open the door. I was trying to yell at them to stop, but it was like they didn't understand what I was saying. They were just grunting and smashing the car doors. The guy at the driver's side door stopped trying to break in for a moment and instead just stood there, staring directly at me. It was just like those vacant stares from the gas station earlier. I can't even begin to explain how horrible that moment was. With no notice at all, he just started screaming. And it wasn't just a normal scream. He was howling and screaming at the top of his lungs. I don't know what came over me at that moment, but I decided that the best course of action was for me to just try and get out of the car and run. I pushed open the door as hard as I could, and thankfully, it was enough force to knock the man over. I ran as fast as I could into the woods, but instead of running blindly into the pitch-black forest, I decided to dive to the ground only several feet into the woods. I hoped that these guys would think I ran deeper into the woods, and thankfully, that's exactly what happened. Moments later, I heard footsteps of several people running by me. When I was sure I heard all of them run by, I quietly got up and ran back to my car. Surprisingly, my backpack and cell phone were still in the car. I grabbed them, stayed low, and just ran as fast as I could down the road. The entire time I was running, I expected them to jump out of the woods, but I never saw them again. About half an hour later, I was able to flag down a passing car. The woman was uncharacteristically kind. I don't know if I would have been so nice and trusting of a screaming man in the middle of nowhere. She called the authorities and even let me sit in her car until the police showed up. I told the cops everything, but as you might expect, there really wasn't anything they could do. There was no evidence of anything malicious other than some small dents in the car door, and given the condition of my car, the cops didn't really believe the dents were caused by them. I also received a couple of tickets for my car, which is just the icing on the cake for this story. I never found out why those people targeted me or what they wanted with me. Clearly, they were not trying to help. All things considered, I'm lucky that I'm here telling the story. All I can say is just be careful out there. You never know what people are capable of, especially when no one's around to witness.